All right, welcome back, everybody. I'm still here with Gill from MTR Corporation, and you've provided us a really great introduction to the organization and stakeholders and how you kind of manage and balance the needs of those stakeholders. We started going down the path of your actual ESG strategy, but I want to pull back a little bit and talk about, A, how you got there, and I'm sure there were very robust conversations about what pillars and focuses and priorities there were going to be, and how you kind of established those three main pillars, and then the actual execution of that and what that looks like, if you don't mind.
Sure, of course. So back in 2020, we revamped our overall corporate strategy. And as part of that, our board of directors were very clear that we should have an enhanced focus on environmental and social responsibility. And so we identified kind of three pillars, which were three areas that were material to our business, but also material to society. And it was more obvious in some ways that we needed a green pillar, because I think just about every organisation does need a green pillar, which we then broke down into a number of different focus areas. On the social side, it was more challenging. And so we had lots of different conversations about where should we focus. Should it be the elderly, because we have an ageing population in Hong Kong? Should it be youth, because they're the future of tomorrow? What about people with disabilities? And it was a real light bulb moment, I would say, that suddenly we landed on social inclusion, because we realised that as a public transport operator, that's at the heart of who we are and what we do. So that was our first pillar. Our second pillar on the social side was really a reflection of the fact that we grow as a business. As we grow, we create opportunities for others to grow alongside us. And so we call it advancement and opportunities. And again, we've broken that down with three different stakeholder focuses. And the brilliant thing about these three pillars is when I explain them to people, whether that's our board, to our staff, to other stakeholders, people sort of sit there and nod, because it feels like MTR. So that was very much the kind of top-down piece. We then went through a huge bottom-up exercise of talking to the different business units, different corporate functions, to understand what they were already doing. Because as MTR, like a lot of organisations, we were doing a lot, but it wasn't terribly well organised, which limited the impact we could have, and it limited our ability to tell the story. So we went and collected this huge amount of data from everybody. What are you doing now? What would you like to do in the future? What are you kind of interested in? And from that, we came up with 10 focus areas underneath the three pillars. So social inclusion, we look at universal basic mobility, workforce D&I, and equal opportunities in the community. From an advancement and opportunities perspective, we look at our workforce, we look at our supply chain, and we look at the startup and academic ecosystem in Hong Kong. And under the green pillar, we look at our carbon emission reductions, or reducing our carbon emissions. Allied to that, we look at generating renewable energy and being more energy efficient. We look at waste management, and finally we look at green and low carbon designs for our future network. And so this was a framework that felt like us, and that genuinely our staff could really take to heart and buy into.
I have a million questions, but I want to go back to the beginning of what you said, because I think for a lot of our learners out there, this may be key. You said the board came and said, hey, we need to have certain focuses, right? And specifically around maybe some ESG related areas. That is maybe not unique, but it's also not normal, I would say. It's not uncommon, but also not common. And I think I just want to speak to that for a moment, because you're one of the rare speakers that we have in this program that has kind of board level sight on these types of things. Is that a factor of the people that you have on the board? Is it due to the fact, quite frankly, MTR is, I don't want to say lucky, but you're in the position where what you do is of social necessity, right? So it's kind of lucky, because your inherent business is there to kind of like literally uphold the fabric and the infrastructure of the society that's here. And so I'm just curious how that originally was framed, because again, this is not, I teach in business school, right? If you were to go into a finance course, an econ course or whatever, they talk about kind of stakeholder management and stuff, but ultimately the incentives are geared towards shareholder-based incentives and profit maximization and whatnot. So again, if you don't mind digging in a little bit deeper, like from a board context, behind those closed doors, how do those conversations happen? Why do you think they cared about that? And then how that then translated into those bottom-up conversations?
Sure. So obviously fantastic, as you say, to have the board on board, because it makes my life a lot easier. And I think a number of things were kind of happening at the same time. One was this general recognition in the community and society that corporates do have a role to play in tackling environmental and social issues. I think we all recognise that government has its role to play, that we can all do our own piece as individuals, but if corporates don't play in this space, they have the resources, both financial but also in terms of innovation and technology to play, and I think they have a responsibility to play. Yeah. Secondly, I think, as you say, in some ways we were in a lucky space as MTR, because low carbon public transport, if we can't get this right, kind of who can? Thirdly, and I think we still have room to go in this space, but I think there is more of an understanding today that there is a business case for investing in environmental and social initiatives. And it's a challenging one, because for the money that we spend on environmental and social initiatives, I can't always show my CEO or my chairman an internal rate of return in financial terms, but I genuinely believe that it's there over the longer term when you take into account things like your investor expectations. So you take into account, certainly in the future, access to and cost of financing. You take into account the regulatory framework. There's a lot of jurisdictions looking at things like carbon tax. Yeah. There's the enhanced reporting requirements from the stock exchange and ISSB. You take into account your staff's, particularly younger employees or potential employees' expectations of the companies that they work for, of being a company that operates responsibly, that has similar values to them. You take into account your customer expectations, and you could say, well, people don't have much of a choice not to travel on the MTR, but certainly our social licence to operate is incredibly important to us. Yeah. And so I think you can really build that business case.
Well, just on that point really quickly, sorry to interrupt you, but I come from a city in Atlanta where they do have a public transportation system, but it's not very well used, because a lot of the conversations early on didn't involve core stakeholders, and so they ended up, putting lines in areas where people didn't have access, or they weren't handling things like maybe potential crime or other things. And so it's not a small thing to say that just because it's the only one doesn't mean it's the only option or the only choice, because we do have buses, people can own cars or other things here. And so I think it's a big deal to say that people used it so much that MTR was able to not only just exist, but actually to thrive and continue growing. And now it's one of the most comprehensive line systems in the world, I would assume, in terms of a city. So anyway, I just want to point out the fact that there were a lot of strategic decisions along the way that involved, I'm assuming, very deep stakeholder conversations to say, okay, where is this actually going to be useful?
Yes.
Talking to the government and saying, okay, where do we see the expansion of the city going? Where are the population centers going to shift to? So, I think that's a great example in terms of what you all have done.
Thank you. And I must give credit to the government there, because I think their foresight in terms of city planning and working out, as you say, where was the population going to move, what transport system do we need to support that. And we've ended up today in a situation where 90% of journeys are taken on public transport in Hong Kong, and about 50% of those are with us. I think also the funding model that we use or have used historically to fund our investment in new lines, which is through the grant of property development rights around and above stations and depots, has enabled us to build these new communities, these new towns in a very sustainable way, because everybody has access to public transport.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, just briefly on that, if you haven't lived or worked in Hong Kong, you may be not exactly clear what that means, but MTR, the government owns all land in Hong Kong, and Yep. They can provide kind of leasehold status for a certain period of time, and MTR is granted rights to build like a station, Yes. Say Olympic or whatever it might be, and then you're granted the right to then build a kind of live-work community on top of that space, Yes. which then allows you to generate revenue for the construction of new lines and things, which is a very unique model. And I want to, if you don't mind, I want to come back to that very briefly, because I think it's a kind of core component to wrap up this part of the conversation. You have this interesting juxtaposition of, on the one hand, your majority shareholder is the government, mm-hmm. Okay, so that's already a little bit unique. And then you've got this, again, kind of public mandate from transportation, also housing, Yes. Shopping. Some of the main shopping centers are MTR owned and leased. I'm just curious, you also said, though, that there are significant concessions for things like people maybe that are elderly, students. I know my children benefit from a student discount if they ride on the MTR. You have this juxtaposition of the government being the main shareholder, but also at the same time providing these concessions. I'm just curious how that conversation goes, because quite frankly, you could be making a lot more money. I think that's fair to say. Yes. And so again, I'm curious how you find that equilibrium, and to the extent you can talk about it, what type of support or pressure does the government give on either side of that to say, hey, we need it to be cheaper for elderly, or we need you to make more money, because they're in a kind of interesting position fiscally, right?
Yes.
Again, it's quite a complicated balance.
It is. And our previous CEO used to say that we had 2 birth certificates at MTR. One was as a listed company with an obligation to generate sustainable financial returns, because although we're talking about ESG today, you have to be sustainable financially. But secondly, we have a very strong second birth certificate as a public service provider. And so our challenge has been over the years, how do we enable the two to support each other? Because if we can provide a better level of public service, then more people will take the MTR, more people will shop in the stations and in the shopping malls, which generate returns that we can then pay back to our shareholders, kind of including the government. And how far do we go in terms of, for example, fare concessions? Again, it's a balancing act. And I do think, putting my legal or governance hat on for the minute, it's genuinely in the interests of our minority shareholders for us to have a good relationship with government. They're our major shareholder, they're our counterparty in lots of the commercial arrangements that we make, they're our regulator. And so we can, I believe, afford to go slightly further than most other listed companies could go when we're asking ourselves what's genuinely in the best interests of MTR.
Yeah.
And the great thing about MTR is that we've always taken an incredibly long-term view about what's in the best interests of the company and about our sustainability as a corporate entity.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point in terms of, we talk a lot, especially in my classes, around like short-term incentives versus long-term incentives, and the way that can drive a company in terms of ethics, in terms of R&D, the way that they invest in the future, et cetera. And I think, definitely as a long-term Hong Kong resident, I think that the long-term perspective that you have taken, and actually sharing that vision, saying 10 years ahead of time, this is where the lines are going to go, et cetera, I think is something that's extremely meaningful and really ties together all these different ESG-related principles.